Knowing that women are disproportionately affected by conflict and climate change, and that more effective and sustainable approaches to conflict resolution and to climate action are possible when there is meaningful participation of women. How do we think through these interlinked issues? And what can we learn from already existing women-led activism in affected contexts? And finally, what is the role of international actors, peacebuilding organizations like Berghof Foundation, but also UN agencies and governments in addressing these topics? I'm very honored today to chair the discussion with such an esteemed panel today to explore these issues with us. And I will introduce our speakers in a moment. But just briefly to let you know that today's event is recorded and that you will be able to watch it on the Berghof Foundation's YouTube channel. We would very much welcome questions from the audience, which we will get to at the end of the event. Please pose your questions by using the Q&A function in Zoom, and please add your affiliation when you ask your question. But before we dive in, I'm very pleased that we have some opening remarks from Andrew Gilmour, the Executive Director of Berghof Foundation, to be followed by a video message from Dr. Hannah Neumann, who's a member of the European Parliament for the German Green Party, and also a member of Berghof Foundation's Advisory Council. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and a very big welcome to everybody as well. So as you will have seen from behind Evelyn's wall, we are celebrating our 50th anniversary, and this event is partly in that context. So we've been working on conflict issues for half a century, and it started in Europe and Germany specifically, but also between East and West Europe. And now we work all over the world. But it's only in the last 2 years that the Berghof Foundation has decided to move quite actively into the climate agenda, specifically the linkages between climate and conflict and the many ways, and to see what it is that we in the peace building and mediation world could do to reduce tensions that come from climate issues, but also if we can help improve the climate situation and the measures taken to adapt. But similarly, we also in the last year have decided to substantially intensify our activities in gender issues. So of course, conflict, gender, and climate are the three things for this meeting, and we are really happy to have this event. We have, a really, really varied and distinguished group of speakers today. I won't go through them all. I just want to say that the Swedish government support to us has been very important. That's why I'm especially happy that Ambassador Calltorp has kindly agreed to speak here as well today. So no more from me. I'm really looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to say.
Dear listeners, dear panelists, dear colleagues, first of all, thank you so much to the Berghof Foundation for organizing this discussion today about the link between women or gender, climate, and security, which I think comes at a very crucial point in time. We see that, and that is something I have been working on a lot in recent years, women are targeted differently in cases of conflict. Women are more vulnerable to conflict, and at the same time, women remain, sadly until today, largely absent when it comes to representation at key peace negotiations, at key ceasefire talks, but also in the implementation on the highest level when it comes to implementing peace deals and moving forward peacekeeping. At the same time, we know the more women sit at the negotiation table, the longer peace lasts. At the same time, we know the more gender equal a society, the more peaceful it is, the less prone it is to wage a war. And this disjunct between women not being represented, yet we would have more peace if they were represented, that 22 years ago prompted us to have the Women, Peace and Security Resolution 1325 of the UN Security Council. Many action plans, a lot of awareness raising, yet implementation is painfully slow. And I think the example of Afghanistan clearly shows us that there is even a danger we are moving backward. Something that is a bit less known is that we have a similar pattern when it comes to women and climate. women are most vulnerable to climate change. 80% of the people that need to leave their homes because of climate change are actually women. At the same time, women only receive about 10% of the funding that goes into agriculture, into forestry, into all these sectors that we need to make a transition possible or to make adaptation possible. We see a similar pattern with the other kind of funding. Only about 1.5% of all that funding that goes into climate adaptation, climate transformation, actually has a focus on gender equality. And when it comes to representation, we see at the highest level, especially at the COP conferences, women are only about 1/4 of the speakers, and most of them are capped into informal track 2 discussions. At the same time, we have statistics as we have them in case of conflict. So the more women we have in parliaments, for example, the more prone the countries are to ratify climate agreements. And the more women we have represented in politics, the lesser greenhouse emission countries to have. So here we see again the same pattern of exclusion or at least underrepresentation of women in the climate area when it comes to decision making, but also when it comes to funding and being supported in adaptation that we see when it came to women in peace and conflict. And it is quite saddening, I have to say, that we are replicating the same problem again. And when both come together, security and the climate angle, and that is quite often the case because 2/3 of the country most affected by climate change are actually fragile states, all these problems become multiplied, and we really need to find strategies on how we can mainstream it both together. Mainstream gender in climate, as well as in peace and security, but also mainstream in climate, in peace and security, and all the three together. And I hope that the discussion that we're having today, which is a discussion that a lot of think tanks, but also in politics, are about to pick up, bring us some answers about how the European Union can move forward in that way. We have an ambitious gender action plan. It has some links to climate, but it's not yet enough. We are embarking at the moment in also thinking about how we can make our foreign policy a key tool for encouraging other countries to implement their Paris Agreement. So how we can have the gender and the conflict sensitivity angle into that one. So hopefully from the examples of Somalia and Sweden that will be represented today, we get some insights. Also from the other experts that are here today. So I will be listening carefully, at least to the video, because sadly I can't be present with you today. And maybe it would also be very interesting for me to hear what are actually your expectations of the role that the EU can play.
Thank you to Hannah Neumann for recording those comments, and thank you also, Andrew, for welcoming us. Also for all of your insightful comments, many of which I'm sure will be picked up by our speakers in the discussion today. So without further ado, let me introduce them just very briefly before we dive in. So I'm very pleased today to be joined by Dr. Chantal de Jonge-Oedraat, who's a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and the former president of Women in International Security, where she's now on the board of directors. Secondly, we are joined by Uba Hussein Diblawe, who's the Minister of Women and Human Rights Affairs in Galmudug State in Somalia. We are also joined by Manana Kotladze, who's the co-founder and chairwoman of Green Alternative, a Tbilisi-based environmental group. Very pleased we're joined by Fida Haddad, who's the forestry officer in the Dryland Program at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And last but not least, we are joined by Sofia Calltorp, the Swedish ambassador for gender equality and co-ordinator of the Feminist foreign policy. So let me open this discussion by just asking one opening question to each of our speakers to get the discussion rolling. So for our first question, we'll go to Dr. de Jonge-Oedraat. Why does gender matter when we are looking at climate change's relationship with conflict? And why do you think gender perspectives are still so often overlooked or siloed in these discussions?
Well, thank you very much, Evelyn. And first of all, happy birthday to the Berghof Stiftung. And congratulations with organizing this panel that really tries to emphasize the triple nexus, the interconnections between climate, gender, and security. So why does gender matter when we are trying to deal with climate change and conflict? And I would say it matters in three main ways. First, it matters because of the different impacts climate change and conflict has on people, that is men, women, and other genders. Second, it matters because it shapes the way we frame the problem. Issues get framed in a gendered way. And third, it matters because our lack of a gender perspective affects the way we respond to climate change and conflict. The lack of a gender perspective leads to suboptimal policy outcomes. Now, let me briefly talk about these 3 points. First, in terms of impact. We know that climate change and conflict has profound impacts and consequences for human society, but these consequences are profoundly gendered. That is to say that the impact of climate change and conflict is not the same for everybody. It's different for men and women, but also for LGBTQ people and economically marginalized people. And I think it is very important that when we are introducing a gender perspective, we do this in an intersectional manner. Compared to men, women are disproportionately affected by climate change because of the social, economic, and political inequalities they are subject to. We know from research, for instance, that women are particularly affected by health impacts that are associated with climate change. And women are more affected by climate-related food security issues. But it is also important to underscore that men also face climate and conflict-generated problems, especially if they take personal risks to live up to social expectations that call for them to be providers or protectors of their families. Lastly, climate-driven instabilities make armed conflict more likely. And this adds, a whole additional array of gender dangers to the equation. Now, second, in terms of the framing of the problem, particularly if you look at the discourse on climate change, it has been a highly masculine discourse, whereby climate change is really seen as a scientific and technical problem that requires technical and scientific solutions. Gender is insufficiently visible and inadequately prioritized in government policies, be it on environment or security issues. The third is in terms of governance and policy responses, and Hannah Neumann already mentioned this. There's great imbalance in terms of representation and participation in security and environmental politics. And this lack of diversity at the governance levels lead to incomplete policy responses and, I would say, suboptimal policy outcomes. Hannah Neumann mentioned the COP26 conference in Glasgow, where women's representation was only 33%. Now, this is progress compared to previous year, but we're still far from parity. So in the conference halls were dominated by men, but outside it was young female activists that dominated. One commentator said, those with the power to make decisions about how the world warms in the coming decade are mostly old and male, but those who are angriest about the pace of the climate action are mostly young and female. Now, very briefly, why has it been so difficult to integrate gender perspectives into the analysis and policy responses? And I think, again, there are sort of three main issues. First is a lack of understanding of gender and a lack of gender expertise. Second is the male-dominated nature of our policy institutions. And third is the siloed policy process. Now, in terms of the first point, in most policy circles, there's very little knowledge about gender. For many policymakers, gender still means women. And in general, in these male-dominated policy circles, women's issues are generally not prioritized. Because policymakers often don't have a good grasp of what gender means, of what a gender perspective is, they think that having a woman's perspective, inviting a woman is enough. Now, as I said, many of our policy establishments, and this is particularly true in the security and environment fields, remain very male-dominated. And they remain sort of oblivious to the impact of gender, the impact of notions of femininity and masculinity on climate and security problems, and also, I would say, on their own decision-making processes. And then third, our policy processes are siloed. Security, environmental, and gender policies are developed in separate bureaucratic organizations. And so, this leads to these suboptimal policy outcomes and sort of lack of coordination between these different bureaucracies.
Thank you so much for outlining so comprehensively what some of the key problems are of why these are still such separate spheres. And I think there's a lot to learn there in terms of, these siloed policy spaces that you speak about, especially also looking at sometimes how we think about it in the peacebuilding field or as policy actors, where we have maybe expertise in one and then sometimes think about the other, but not truly bring them together. I want to turn to our second speaker, to Minister De Blauwe, and there's already a question in the chat that sort of preempts my question that I was going to ask you, which is basically, how is conflict in Galmudug State and in Somalia more widely affected by climate change and gender factors, and what maybe could be done about it as well?
I have to think. There's a light that's blurring my. Is that hi? Can you see me better now?
Yes, we can see you fine.
Good. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Berghof, for hosting this esteemed meeting and on climate change and how it affects 2011. I went to Somalia for the first time in 20 years since the war happened, and as a volunteer. And the reason why I went there was the hardest drought in 6 decades hit it in Somalia. It was a lot of people migrated to Mogadishu, and there was a lot of IDP camps formed. And when that happened, a lot of kids dying, women dying, vulnerable adults. And I said, I need to volunteer. That time profession, I was working as a nurse. I'm like, least I can do is volunteer my time and my skills. I went to Somalia with the local organization from Rochester, Minnesota. And I ended up working with German Doctors Without Borders in Benadir Hospital, with the hospital of mom and mothers and children. The effect that time, the malnourishment, the diseases, the kids and the women who are migrating to the city, it was just enormous. Till today, 2022, the drought still exists. We just had actually in Gilmour a few weeks ago, death-related drought because of lack of water and food in the capital of Gilmour, Dusam Rep. There was a few people, kids and children and women died. The effect it has climate change on overall Somalia is huge. In Gilmour particularly, because it's a dry state to begin with. It's not the south where greenery and rivers go through. It's just every year after year, it's just that the effect of the climate just is evidence. And the sad thing is, there is no programs in place. People are clueless about what climate change is. And when this happens, the people who bear the most, that actually affects horribly, is women. When there is lack of water, villagers migrate to the nearest well that they can get water for their animals, for themselves. The villagers who were there before will take the control of the well and refuse the other people to come. There will be a conflict, clan conflict. Will be a death. Now, people who are fighting, of course, are male. Now, the woman will become widow because of that fight. Now she'll become poor, and she might lose family members, brother, aunt, uncle, so on. And the other thing is, as hard it gets to get water, or even to fetch firewoods, women become more vulnerable. They walk long distance in Galmudug or any other part of Somalia to get water, to get firework, to take their goats for grazing. And in that process, women become more vulnerable to gender-based violence, GBV. We had, end of 2020, a young girl, same name as mine, Oba, who was 17 years old, pregnant, and trying to fetch firewood, suburb of one of the districts. In the process, got killed, raped, and killed. The way he killed her, actually, I received some pictures from the scene, and he slaughtered her like a goat, and just a horrific picture on her neck and her face, and the way she died alone was really gruesome. And till today, when I remember, I get really bad emotion about it. And that is because of, again, climate change. The effect it has on women. I 100% agree everything Dr. I believe Chantal de Jong, I hope I'm saying your name right, how policy and all the programs are technically excluded women when it comes. You will see an organization or a government entity running climate change programs, and there's no one single female in it, whether it's the leadership or the program management or any of that. There will be conferences or meeting regarding women, regarding climate change. Zero invitation for women. So the way I believe we can at least do something is it is people in the region that still continue cutting trees, plastic everywhere, cheap plastic, trash everywhere, environment just degrading, and nothing really is happening. We had a law passed in Galmudug about environment, but there's no enforcement and there's no knowledge about it. I believe women is a center of this whole climate change. It affected us, it killed us, we become widow because of it, we become urban poor. Women migrate when they lose their animals, so their little livelihood of whatever that they would do in the villages, they come to the city looking for a better life, and then they become urban poor, and then they're subject to more even GBV and all the other heinous crime that happens to women. So in order to really include women, we really have to, especially the European Union, the UN, the US, any major country organization that's proposing environmental policies or bills or grants or whatever, to include women-led organizations so that women can have a voice and women can be part of that training, part of that participation for climate change. Also, if it's the government institution, include Ministry of Women, whether they are federal member state level, like me, or whether they are federal level. When we have a woman on the table, then we can have a voice. One incident that happened in Galmudug recently was the Ministry of Environment received gas stoves, portable, two small gas stoves, about 600 pieces of them. And instead of even asking us, or talking to the women associations or women businesses that who can get this gas stove because they are able to buy a refilling gas in the future, they took it to the local district, and the machines were selling on the streets a few days later. And that shows, like, okay, who cooks food in Somalia? I can tell you 90% or 99% is a woman. So if you have a gas stoves for the state, the least you can do is involve the Minister of Women or the Women Association and ask, hey, could you come and distribute this to the appropriate family who can afford refilling the gas, because refilling gas is not cheap. So poor people will not benefit, but at least the middle class or people who can afford can benefit, but they were not included. That's just a small example of how disconnectment of female is affecting climate change resources or talks. Women can take part of the climate change conflict that comes peace resolution. A lot of women coming from Mogadishu and the regions joining during the conflict in Gilmour between the government and the Ahl Sunnah. We had a women association going to the small villages, taking part of the peace initiative between two sub-clans. Women are half of the population, if it's not more than in Somalia or any other country. And if we exclude them, or then we just lose. And that's actually one thing I really want to emphasize is inclusion of women on this, not only even leadership level, but anything that we are doing it to include women in general. I think my time is up. I hope I covered everything, but I'm here if you have any question or comment. And I really thank you so much for having me on this beautiful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And thank you for really outlining what the links between gender-based violence and poverty, especially relating to widowed women, and the climate-based conflict that is the cause of it, like how all these relate. And thank you also for emphasizing the importance of including women-led organizations at different levels when these policy decisions get made. And it's actually a perfect segue to our next speaker. I want to turn to Manana Kovladze, who is the leader of such an organization. And I just want to ask Manana, in your perspective, what is the role of civil society actors and NGO precisely in making this link between gender and climate action and climate concerns and gender stuff? And what are the main lessons from your experience as an activist in this field?
Thanks a lot for invitation in very important event, because we are now speaking about this lack of the understanding, what are the links between the gender, climate change and conflicts itself, and how it needs to be addressed in a way that the gender, all our gender roles have been really been and achieved, because all of, as it's correctly was said, often we speaking about, when we speak about the gender, we are speaking about the woman, but it also has its roots, because till now, this woman question is really one of the mainstreaming question. And from the Central and Eastern European perspective, I can say that often the women are the first who are denying that they have the problem in enjoying all the rights the men have. We have the situation like in Georgia, where I'm from, we have 11 MPs in the parliament of the Georgia, and even we have we do this equality test during this parliamentary election, but somehow then the women start to refuse because it was agreed already beforehand with the political party. So situation is really the people not understand why women, LGBTQ people, and the others should be on the table when the decisions are taking about our future, because as it was said, the climate change is the very sexiest action, and the climate action we are designed, unfortunately, is also sexiest. And this was very perfectly underlined when we speak, for example, about the green economy, and even in the sector where the people are employed, women are employed right now, agricultural sector, we know that the investments for the green economy in the agricultural sector will give opportunity only 25% of the women, which is right now is employed in the sector. This is really, really big discrimination. And one of the major issues which we are doing, this is like raising the awareness of the general public and also very specific political parties, why these issues are important, why they need to see these connections between the climate change, environment in general, conflict, and resources, and how these conflicts needs to be addressed. Another really important issue is that we are really working with the policymakers, both within a country, in the countries of the Central and Eastern Europe, but also with the financial institutions that providing the money to our governments and our companies to ensure the gender equality when they are when they're providing investments, when they are defining the climate actions. And here the major things are, in some cases it's very successful, in some cases is not that successful, and sometimes even the European Union institutions are not that sensitive to that issue. And this is really, I would say, alarming, because we still, for example, when there is the big infrastructural projects or big economic projects are prepared, that we still have no simple thing which is really important for the decision making, disaggregated data by the sex and gender. So how you can take the important decision when even you don't know how these decisions will impact the people, if you will start to do them by the group. So this is the one issue. Another thing is that in the majority of the countries, and including the European Union, we are speaking about the environmental impact assessment that maybe often precisely describe the climate impact on of the particular project, or how the climate will impact that of this particular region. But the social impact assessment, gender impact assessment, gender analysis, how this decision will impact, this is still lacking. And we are really working very hard with the banks like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which recently became really champion, I would say, among the other IFIs, and pushing and tries to integrate the gender in its policies and its decision making. And this is also important, for years or even decades, we have the gender issue somewhere separately, it was absolutely separate. And so you have the checkbox, and under this checkbox, the last thing usually it was the gender and environment. These boxes have been checked, but they never have been integrated to each other. So the full pictures was not there. So this is also our role of the civil society to really work with the decision makers, and this is really important. And then you ask about us about the lessons we are learning, and together with the lessons I already mentioned, one is more important lessons is that until all the political the governments and political parties and financial institutions, everybody who is taking decisions about the political directions as well as financial and economic directions would not take the both environment and gender seriously. Seriously means that there would be no, it would not be like, these topics would not be listed like the last things when the decisions are taken. Nothing would be changed, unfortunately, because often we see that or this project brings quite big problems to the large groups, women, elderly, children, but these projects are still pushing, and environment, and these projects are still pushing forward based on the assumption that this will bring some economic gains, which is under the state of the interest. And this non-clear state of the interest, this not clear economic gains, because economic gains should go to particular groups, and we should see that these groups are benefiting. For now, what we see is that from even from the development money, this beneficial distribution of the benefits are very unfair, and it's unequal. And until that would not be changed, unfortunately, we could not really move both agendas, I mean the climate action and the gender agendas forward, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manana. I'm outlining some really important points, especially, this lack of an evidence base that you still talk about, where we don't even disaggregate the effects of that some of these big infrastructure projects or other programs will have on different population groups. The social and gender impact assessment alongside environmental impact assessments, I think is really important. And then the other point that I really want to emphasize is how important it is to think gender from the beginning, right? Like you spoke about, that it's not something we tick on at the end of some activity that we're planning or some fund that we're distributing, but that it has to be thought into the program from the beginning to actually have an impact. So thank you very much. I want to turn to Fida Haddad and the FAO sort of UN perspective. So you heard also what the other speakers had to say, what the situation in Gilmour is as a very dry state as it is, and I know you're an expert on these kind of areas. And so from your perspective at FAO, what should gender-sensitive approaches to climate change and conflict look like, especially when considering conflict areas in dryland ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this panel. And when I received this invitation with the highlight that you want me to highlight the drylands, this is very important ecosystem, actually, because most of the reports, the IPCC reports, the whole warning around that the drylands will be the most ecosystem impacted by the climate change. And in terms of the impact of climate change in drylands, it's expected to increase by 10% by the end of the 21st century, to have more areas, countries to face more drought, degradation, and desertification. And what this means for the drylands, this means that half of the world that produce the production system for the most of the globe will be impacted by this land degradation. And who will be the first one will be impacted are the communities, the producers, either small producers or even the private sectors. Here we have to consider also that climate change considered now as a threat multiplier, but not for sure leads to the conflict, as most of the research or findings, but it's play a major role to increase the tension and the pressure on the dryland resources. And because of drylands has this unique system, as we said, production system, but at the same time have many challenges like weak governance, institutional, social cohesion, structure of most of the countries will make the conflicts and will make the climate change impacted more on the communities. And what I want to also echo my colleagues that I just mentioned about the gender that is not linked to women, and gender and women participation is not only a box to tick. And before we start pointing out who's vulnerable, who's not vulnerable in this context of climate change and conflict, we have to understand the gender itself. We have to understand that it's the relation that influence and uphold power dynamic between different groups of people. And it depends, and it's not the same for female and male, even in the same setting. Gendered norms and power structures can also increase or mitigate the likelihood of climate change risk. So we have to play around these topics. So for example, as just mentioned by Her Excellency, Ms. Diploe, she mentioned or highlighted that countries like Somalia, which is in dryland regions, for example, where women facing a lot of challenges, inequalities, limited participation in decision-making process, limited access to information or financial resources, and at the same time, highly dependent on environmental resources that make them more experienced to risk of the climate change and conflict. And in drylands, we found most of researchers highlighted that such conflicts escalate violence against women and youth, actually. And these kinds of conflicts also impacted their access to service and support. Of course, the conflict processes leading to conflict and violence are more complicated than this, but here we have to start thinking of conflict gender sensitive approach to address the ability or to address the community resilience, to understand the interaction between the context and our interventions, how we should act, how we should minimize the negative impact of our interventions, or even positive impacts of our intervention in the context of conflict. And here also back to the point of the gender norms and power structures can also influence why and how men and women may participate in activities that lead to the peacemaker under the conflict situation in drylands. And both of them will be acting differently. Unfortunately, because of the context of resource management and the gendered norms, in some, we found that deciding women out of participating and being as a part of the decision-making level. So both working in conflict, in and on conflict must be gender sensitive approach. And this is what we tried with our members and partners to define how we can play around our interventions in terms of achieving the nexus in drylands and support the participation of the communities and less impact on different groups like women and men, farmers and pastoralists, especially that the high rates of food insecurities exist in drylands. And I think my colleagues behind the scene are putting in an interactive map where we produced for the Food Summit, and we tried to highlight how and where and why drylands areas are more impacted by conflict and the climate change, with some good cases to define the nexus between such approach. So in a nutshell, the idea is how to make the inclusive more sensitive and function in dryland based on the differentiation between the different gender norms and gender structure to support the peace activities, regardless little b, high b, that leads into the new discussion on nexus, and how women can play a part of improving her community's resilience and work. So regardless working under conflict or in conflict, we have to make sure that the gender sensitive approach are there, but not just to include that women books is thick, is to include that different perspectives are there, and our interventions are addressing different communities, different needs, to avoid more tension and at the same time build the peace toward improving nexus in dry lands.
Thank you so much, Fida, and especially for highlighting the effects that a patriarchal power structure has on all different parts, on sort of reacting to climate change, on peace building, on food security, etc. And I think that's really like one of the key takeaways, that we cannot just think about, also as Dr. de Jonge said in the beginning, we cannot just think about, oh yeah, we need to include women and then that's fine. It is, really about thinking about the power structure and how that affects all these different parts that we are working on. So I want to encourage our audience to send their questions in the Q&A function if they have any. And I'm turning now to our final speaker, to Ambassador Calltorp. Thank you so much for joining us. Sweden has really taken the lead in terms of setting the bar for having a feminist foreign policy, and I'm very pleased that the new German government is also trying to move into that direction. So I want to ask you, Ambassador Calltorp, how does the gender, climate and conflict nexus feature in feminist foreign policy, especially in the Swedish case, and maybe also for other governments, and to learn from your experience, what were the challenges or are still the challenges in implementing this?
Thank you very much. And as others, I'm extremely pleased and honored to be at this very timely and important event. I think the gender, climate, conflict nexus that we are highlighting here is really a key issue for us to address, and in order to solve many of sort of the global challenges that we see today. And Chantal and others have very clearly made the points why gender matters. We have heard about various examples on how women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change, by conflict, but I also think it's important to highlight that women and girls are also important agents for change when it comes to both climate action and peace building, and to really see how to bring the gender issue into the heart of both the climate change discussion and our peace building work. That's something that Sweden has been working on for a long time as part of our feminist foreign policy, and at the very heart of that, I mean, Sweden was the first country in the world to launch a feminist foreign policy in 2014, and we did that very much because we saw that gender equality is a prerequisite if we want to address and solve the global challenges that we are facing today, climate change and conflict being two of those challenges. So the need for a holistic response and a holistic approach where we bring gender equality at the very center of the solutions. That's where the feminist foreign policy is coming from, and that is how we have been working over the past 8 years, addressing the broad security concept, but of course climate change and peace building are two of our priority areas. So to see how we can use the feminist foreign policy and sort of mainstream gender equality into our action has been a key feature for us over the past 8 years. I mean, mainstreaming is sort of a concept and a word that I think is very much misused. What we mean and how we have approached this is to really apply a systematic gender perspective to everything we do. I mean, from our trade policy to our security policy to our bilateral development programs, we really look at the issue at hand from first and foremost a gender perspective, and we have developed sort of quite practical working method that we have found extremely useful. I think many of the speakers earlier have talked about the importance of participation and representation, that women are severely, systematically underrepresented, both when it comes to climate negotiations and climate work worldwide, but also in terms of peace building. I think that around only 13% of peace negotiations are have sort of women mediators included. So increasing the participation and representation of women in forums where decisions are made is key. But linked to that also, of course, listening to women's experiences. We heard from Somalia that women are an extremely important actor when it comes to finding solutions to many of the challenges that we're facing. So participation where decisions are made, but also bringing women's voices into the discussion and into the solutions. So that's the third R of the feminist foreign policy. The second R is rights. Of course, the issue of participation and making sure that women are represented is linked to the fact that women's rights very often are systematically not respected. The issue of violence against women and how that links both to the climate change issue and the wider security issue that we heard about is one such an issue. So rights is the second of our 3 R's in our feminist foreign policy. The third one, which I think is also extremely important, is resources, because in order to bring women into this nexus and make sure that we have a gender perspective, we need to make sure that women have resources to participate, but also to make sure that we see very often that women's ownership to land, for example, is not very often respected. There is a disproportionate discrimination of women in terms of ownership, also in terms of budgeting. Often we see that resources are distributed in a way that is uneven towards women. So working with those 3 R, that is representation, rights, and resources, and really make sure that the gender perspective is at the center of everything, of the when we look at identifying the challenges, but also the solutions. That's very much at the heart of the feminist foreign policy. And as I said, Sweden was the first country to launch this in 2014, but we are now 8 more countries that is pursuing this approach. So for us now, looking into how we can work with partner countries and make sure that we have a feminist perspective systematically integrated in the climate action, in the peace building action, and how we can look at this triple nexus. But I would insist with gender at the center, because as said, for us, the gender equality is a prerequisite if we want to come further solving the global challenges. So a very interesting discussion, and I'm extremely pleased to be part of it and look forward to continue the discussion with my colleagues and with the audience here on how we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Calltorp. With an eye to time, I think what we'll do is I will take a couple of questions that were already posed by the audience, and I will go through the speakers again in the order that they've spoken, and they will welcome to pick up any of these questions or any reactions or comments to the speakers that you've heard. I hope this works for everyone. And I have a bit of editorial control about the questions also. There was a question by Lisa Yorke, and it was posed to Uba, but I think it's actually a relevant question for all of you, which is that she's wondering that in male-dominated societies, it is often difficult to identify the right women to include in particular processes. And so she's wondering if you have any practical suggestions and how women can be better represented and meaningfully included in any of these processes in the organizations that you are a part of, from governments to activism to international organizations. A second question that has come up by Bishishta Hilali, and I think it's a really important one. And they're asking that specifically about the case of Afghanistan, but I think it can also be applied to other cases. They're saying that among so many other problems, Afghanistan is facing already the issue of climate and gender issues in some parts of the country. But because of already existing problems, less attention is being given to it. Is there a policy approach, or is there one in the making, for how to deal with the issue of climate, gender, and conflict in countries like Afghanistan, where we are dealing with a government which might not be particularly interested in addressing these issues? And then I have a final one by Jacqueline Henke, which is originally pointed at Ambassador Calltorp, but also anyone else feel free to take it up. Does it make sense to link the enhancement of gender inequality to international financial support? So donor politics, I think, is the question here. Or does this only lead to an undermining of gender equality? For example, it's used as a catchword, but it's not really implemented afterwards. So how do we deal with this? So I'll leave it at that. And please feel free to take on any of these. Dr. De Jonge Udraat, first over to you.
Thank you. Those are very interesting questions. And maybe in terms of the first question is, it's hard to find the women. It's often because there's no real effort that is made to actually invite women. What I was struck by, though, is the thing that was emphasized by my co-panelist is the fact that the way we frame problems really determines how we understand problems. And, in most of our policy circles, we see climate change, security, and gender as sort of distinct problems. Although we know that they are multidimensional, and as Ambassador Sofia Calltorp has mentioned, we really need a holistic approach if we want to address these issues. But having such a holistic approach is difficult when you have issue-specific departments that have their own priorities, their own regulations, and most importantly, their own budgets. So, how can you break through that sort of siloed policy development? And I want to suggest sort of 6 potential ways of how to break those policy silos. First of all, I think it is very important to be deliberate about it, breaking down silos. Be deliberate of wanting to invite a more diverse group of people to your negotiating table or to your policy development table. I think also, as many of my co-panelists have said, I think it's very important to make gender and the integration of gender perspectives a priority. And in that sense, it is really important to establish some baseline data, to do a gender analysis of the societal inequalities that exist. So for instance, if you want to deal with, as an international actor, with a country like Afghanistan, I think it is really critically important that you do a gender analysis of what is actually going on in that country. You're not just looking at women as victims, but you look at the power structures of that country as a whole. And, critically examine and framing the problem, I think, is really key. But I would add that we talk about the nexus between climate, security, and gender, but we still have very little knowledge and understanding of the exact linkages of how these linkages and causal relations work. And I think it is, and here maybe I address myself to the Swedish ambassador, it's really critically important to support research and research networks that bring together scholars, policymakers, practitioners, both from the security, the climate change, and the gender fields. Because I think only when we establish more knowledge, more data, more analysis, when we understand better what these linkages are we better to able to have more specific and targeted policy responses. And then lastly, I would say, more generally, when you're making policy, it's really important to have feedback loops of evaluation and monitoring. You have to continuously sort of assess what you're learning, integrate that, and learn lessons from that.
Thank you. And yeah, especially on that last point, I think also a degree of flexibility in terms of donor politics to sort of explore some of these avenues and try out specific things, I think would be really appreciated by many. But I want to turn over to our second speaker, Minister De Blauwe. Do you want to take up any of these questions or add any comments to the other speakers?
Thank you so much. Again, I 100% agree with Dr. Chantal and the approach of looking overall, like what's the cause, which problem is specific to each country, or the way gender and climate is affecting. In Somalia, for example, we are still cutting trees and using charcoals, and people have a plastic everywhere, trash everywhere. So in order to entertain that problem, then we have to think how women can be part of that on that issue. If I come back on the how can we include women in male dominant society, a country like Somalia or Afghanistan, it's very difficult, and most of the time it will come down to donor countries to impose on the country or the organization or the government entity overall policy to have women be presented. In this an example, and I was giving this seat not because the president knew me or liked me or any other way, like it was because of the quota. It was very clear that when you're forming your administration, we need to have a quota, women quota, be part of the administration. So having that in mind, they say, okay, Minister of Women will give it to women. And that was it. I'm the only key ministers, I believe, in the 20 plus post, and then a few of deputy ministers, and that's it. The rest of them are men. So unless the UN started a long time ago about women's quota on Somali politics, whether it's a parliamentary or Senate or city council or FMS ministry formation, we need to have an approach like that where the climate change front runners to be imposed a requirement of women. How can we get qualified women or women who can make a change, or which organization? That's again, it's the research, like she mentioned, Chantal, that we have to look. And in Somalia in particular, I believe the diaspora is a huge asset that we can use them. Almost every European country or America, North America, we have a large of diaspora, female, educated, very passionate about the climate change. We just have to find them, or maybe have a platform where we can spot them and recruit them, like inviting them, engaging them social Twitter. That's the research again, not the research, but one of the at least way we can include. So unless we make a really effort and make it very, very clear on how are we going to achieve that on any organization, so any government entity, I think the representation and women being in crucial places is going to be limited. I had a post of gender advisor that the Swedish government gave it to me. Just want to say that thank you, the ambassador and her country, that was giving specific to Minister of Women, and they made it very clear. They say, we are going to give you 5 positions, but one of them has to be for the Minister of Women. And because of that, I received one advisor. If it was not clear by the donor side, I doubt it. The Minister of Gilmour administration will say like, oh, let's just give this post to the Minister of Women. That doesn't happen. There's nothing really out there for women. We have to either fight, we have to make our voice, the donors have to fight with us, then we might get something. So unless it's a very clear cut like that. And the funny thing is, even when the post was advertised, it was open for anybody. So I have a male calling me, or their friends or their family calling me saying that, oh, you know, so-and-so, he's very experienced, blah, blah. And I made very clear, I say, I'm sorry, this is the only gender post I received, and I'm not going to give it a man. Unfortunately, I don't care how much experience you have. I'll wait until I get a qualified female, which I got it. So it has to be, we have to make an effort, and we have to really do a research, and we have to engage, and we have to see what's working, how we can get women there. It's not an easy job, but we have to make it very clear cut and a requirement almost anywhere we can go. Thank you. I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. No, definitely. Thank you for your insights. And before I turn to our last 3 speakers, I just want to throw a couple more questions from our audience in the mix for you to choose from. One which was asked specifically about the feminist foreign policy and its relationship to intersectionality. And aside from women as a group, how does diversity play a role in your feminist foreign policy? And I assume this is mostly for Ambassador Calltorp. But then there was another question asked, which I think is particularly relevant at the moment when we see what's happening with the war in Ukraine. And I just want to add that in case any speaker might want to pick it up. And I'll also open it later to the other 2 that have already spoken. And the question is that gendered hierarchies are sometimes used to naturalize militarized answers to the climate crisis, defined as a security crisis often. And in what ways do you think is the climate crisis securitized? And would we not have to demilitarize in order to achieve climate and gender justice? And often demilitarization is not really addressed when addressing the climate, gender, and security nexus. And we also haven't really spoken about it today. So I just wanted to add that if anyone would want to pick it up, or just to leave it open for us to think about further. But first, Manana, did you want to come back to any of these questions or comment on what the other speakers have said?
Yeah, may I comment first of all about the international financial policy institutions as my specialization. I think the gender for the banks and the IMF, it was like catchy word maybe 10 years ago, but it's not anymore catchy. It becomes more and more real problem for them, because they understand that the more the complex the decisions are, more not taking into account that the diversity groups that are out of the these particular problems decision structure is creating even more and more problems. So we see that the bigger, large infrastructural projects may not only increase the climate emissions, but they may increase the poverty in the vulnerable groups. It can increase the trafficking and the sex prostitution and this kind of thing, which is again is the cost for the government to be addressed. And here I really want to again thank the Swedish government, because they're not only providing the money for the groups like us, but they also are the most, I would say, only actually allies in that institution when they are bring our agenda and really putting it forward. And I really wish that the other governments also, especially from the European Union, are taking the gender and the climate in that sense that the Swedish government is doing, especially also in the case of the war like right now we have in the case of the Ukraine, because this war will have and it already have the heavy impact on environment and the climate, and we also see it already have the impact on the women and children, you know, and it will also have the very, very problematic impact on the men, because it's like, but it would be afterwards, you know. So the militarization, we are never speaking about that, but of course that is the one of the major issues we need to speak. And for years there was the big movement for the nuclear disarmament, but then somehow these movements disappeared, and now we see what we see. So this is really important, that we are really starting to using all the powers, you know, economic power, political power, but also this peace talks power, in a way to try to balance our system in a way that we don't hurt the earth does not hurt us, and within the society we are not really pushing and marginalizing different groups and not giving them the right to live in a way they want, not giving them the economic power or political power because we don't like them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manana. Fida, any points you wanted to raise?
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. Well, actually, I want to complement what the great panelists already mentioned, but here we have to see the different side of the coin. Yes, we need to involve women and to be part of the process, and we need donors to keep funding, supporting countries, government to do and to strengthen the presence, the participation of women in their policy. But at the same time, we are still, as also mentioned and highlighted by my colleagues here, that we have to address 2 points as well. Looking into the willingness of the decision makers, communities, stakeholders, to address the need of different groups with special attention, for example, to the women. And at the same time, looking into our activities and our support to have women on the table. So for example, after Madrid COP, there was an opportunity for a cycle of a new 5 years to review the indices. And I read 2 weeks ago an assessment where, even though not all countries included the gender components in their indices or in their action plan, or if gender and per se women empowerment included in their indices, you found that it's not part of the country policy, climate change policy or action plan. So what I mean here is that even at the national level, even at the level of national district stakeholder policy makers, we still need to raise awareness, we still need to build their capacities. And the donor role is not only to make sure that the quota is there and number of women are there, we have still to build the capacity of different stakeholders, and where it's back to the point of how we frame the problem, how we frame the intervention, how we make plan and space even for the men to be part of gender empowerment or women empowerment approach. It's not a women per se. And unfortunately, if you look into or analyze most of the indices, climate action plans, you found that women either under vulnerable, marginalized, a small group, human rights, blah, 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 and looking to women as victim only, but not as an agent of change to provide a solution and provide the work. And this is what I want just to highlight at the end, is like, okay, still we need also to address the knowledge management, the knowledge sharing between countries to provide replicable cases, promises, practices to support other countries in how to mainstream gender, and not only to mainstream and like having the numbers more than, and just to have more responsive action to support countries like Afghanistan, other countries on how to mainstream gender and how to involve women in their participation. And this is what we are trying to do also in FAO in drylands. We're having the women from different organizations and even organizations, CSOs that includes men as well, to advocate for women role, women voices at a global level and at global arenas. So it's that, and what we call it a We Can network. So what we need is disseminate the knowledge, build the capacity, and go beyond the quota, go beyond the only, yes, we have this money to hire women, or we have this quota. We have to build the capacity and engage different groups, stakeholders, and communities in the way of like holistic manner, frame out the problem or the interventions.
Thank you so much, Fida. And finally, I'll turn to Ambassador Calltorp to address any of these points. And then I just want to give our speakers a little heads up that after this round, I will ask you each for any sort of final key messages, recommendations for policymakers, governments, peacebuilding organizations like the Berghof Foundation. I know our team has been scribbling some notes of all the things you've already said, but just in case there's any key messages. And I will go in reverse order. So this is mostly a heads up to Ambassador Calltorp that if you want to, after any responses you have to the questions, I will ask on you for any final recommendation and statements. So over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's been really a fascinating and rich discussion. And just picking up on a few points. I mean, Fida, you mentioned what you mentioned last about building networks and partnerships. I think that is really key. And also that of course, gender equality is not only a women's issue, but it is, I mean, we need to bring everyone into this discussion. And we have done quite some interesting work nationally where we can see how our gender equality policies are benefiting not only the women, but the society as a whole. And I think that is something that we need to really also emphasize, that gender equality, as I said earlier, is a prerequisite to solve many of the global challenges. And that is, of course, not only to the benefit of women, but of the society as a whole. So that's key, and to see how we can form those networks and alliances. And that brings also, there was a question on intersectionality. I think that speaks also to that point, in the sense that, of course, gender equality, we heard about that. It's very much about power structures and power dynamics was mentioned earlier, and that's, I think, where the intersectionality issue is also key to bring to the table. And then also very much agree with Chantal in terms of the support for research networks and the feedback loops, and how can we sort of make sure that what we are doing is actually leading to something. And I mean, Sweden was pioneering this, the feminist foreign policy. There is quite some research now coming out of research institutions on what effect that has had. That's going to be very interesting. But I also wanted to say that when I talked about our 3 R's, rights, representation, and resources, and how we work with that, I think the 4th R, sorry, which I forgot to emphasize, is of course the reality, because we really have to be context specific. I also think many of the examples that we have heard today highlights the need to be context specific in when looking at what do we do. I mean, that we put gender equality at the center is key, but then we really need to look at each and every context on what that means in practice. And then last, the financing issue that's been addressed already to a certain extent. But I mean, I agree. I think that sort of gender equality was very much a catchword earlier. It is possibly to a great extent, but definitely we, as Sweden, as one of the largest contributors of, for example, funding, unearmarked funding to the UN or to the World Bank, is really putting a lot of emphasis on following up what this means in practice. But I also wanted to highlight the need for specific funding and financing to women's organizations and to gender specific interventions. We also heard that when it comes to climate change and adaptation, we can see that women very often sits with the solutions, and then of course we as donors need to fund them. So that was my comments to the discussions. I don't know if I should move into some final recommendations now, or hand the floor.
Please go ahead, yes.
To you. So no, it's been really fascinating, and I think that this is a conversation that is sort of long overdue. We talked a lot about women and conflict. We are starting to talk about women and climate, but bringing those discussions together and really see how they are interlinked is key. And from the Swedish government, definitely we are very keen to continue to engage with you. And again, what Chantal mentioned in terms of research network, this is an issue where I think that a lot of more work needs to be done in order to understand actually what are the linkages and what can be done. And we are looking forward to be part of that discussion and to see how we, with our feminist foreign policy, can continue to pursue the gender perspective throughout. So with that, and in conscience of time, I hand it back over to you, Evelyn. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia. That's really well taken. Thank you for your insights. So moving in reverse order, we have 6 minutes, and so I'll give each speaker 1 minute to share their final key message or recommendation with us. So next, over to Fida.
Yeah, thank you again. Just quickly to highlight that we don't have that much time. We are not in a luxury to wait. We are not in a luxury to still discuss what we need to do. Less than 10 years to 2030 agenda. And we have a lot of decades that we need to comment on. But if we look into the policies and the monitoring systems we have in place, still segregated data are not exist. So how we will move forward to improve the gender representation, consideration, responsiveness into climate change and move into peace building. So we have to keep the momentum, strengthen our partnership, support our member states, support our countries with more research, with more action on the ground, and support the monitoring system by having more gender segregated data that can help to reach out to the real needs, regardless women or men in the communities, to avoid further conflict, contribute to the peace in terms of long-term, short-term, and avoid further tension and degradation, if I want to say on dry land, but this is applicable to the whole world as well. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Fida. Over to Manana.
Thanks a lot. I will continue what Fida said. We need more data, we need more research, we need to learn the lessons, and maybe the war in Ukraine is also one of the lessons learning exercise which we need to take. We need to review from the gender list the climate change impacts. We need and action, energy policy, as well as the food security, because at the end everything is like created. So this is like we need to use all the opportunities, to make the gender and the climate owned by us, not to be imposed by quota, but owned by us genuinely in a way that we automatically take them into the decision making. Thank you.
Thank you, Manana. Over to Minister De Blauwe.
Hi, thank you so much. It was really great having this discussion, and I appreciate all the great panelists, Berghof organization, foundation organizing this. I would support, since I'm—
Sorry, I think there's an issue with the sound. Is it just me? No, okay. Can you your microphone over?
Can you hear me better now? Hold on 1 second. I'm sorry. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, it's perfect now. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. I'm sorry. So I'll be quick. My recommendation will be, and I agree all the panelists, their recommendation and their view. The thing is, we need to have a more information. We know there's a climate change issue, and we know conflict caused by climate change, and we know that there is gender disparity. Now the question is, how can we go about and what can we do? And I'm speaking on behalf of a Gilmour citizen. That's where I'm at right now. We need to have a mapping, like how this is affecting women specifically and children, climate change, and what the conflict is causing to these vulnerable groups. So mapping / research and on this issue. Then once we find out the key areas that really affecting specifically on this region, then have a training and be partner with the government, to be partner with the local women organization led by local women, and partner with them and do a training women association. When I say women association are a really great asset. They can take this initiative to the next level, and they are on the ground. And I'm talking about district level. I'm sorry, my background is health. I like to do find the cause and then do the intervention on the cellular level. So in this case, in a local district, small village level, if you can make
and maybe come up while we are working on the bigger
platform for gender equality and the climate change, and how we can affect the donors, that platform. At the same time, we can work on the bar, and we can make a huge difference. Like in where I am right now, I'm passionate about gender and climate change, yet I have no resources, and just trying to get anything that I can work, or any organization, to do this kind of type of work. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. And finally over to Dr. de Jonge Oudra.
Thank you. Three very brief remarks. Somebody in the audience mentioned the problem of militarization and securitization of the climate change issues. And of course, it's a problem when we look at problems in a very unidimensional way. But I would say maybe it's also an opportunity. Securitization of a problem often elevates such a problem to a policy priority. And that provides maybe opportunities to broaden the conversation and the analysis of the problem. Second, I think, and related to this, is that we as activists, we have to be pragmatic about these issues and not too ideological, because if we're too ideological, we're not going anywhere. And then third, I was very happy to hear that everybody is sort of emphasizing the need for more knowledge, more understanding, more research, the bringing together of multidisciplinary networks that bring together not just experts, scholars, but also practitioners and policymakers, and in that sense would also fulfill and respond to the fourth R of the Swedish feminist foreign policy, that is checking this with reality. So those would be my brief recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all so much to all our panelists for your great insights and recommendations today. It was really valuable for me to be part of this discussion. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to the Gender and Diversity Working Group at the Berghof Foundation, especially Lara, Amelie, Laura, Callum and Dagmar for their work in the background to make this event happen. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for your questions and for joining us today. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel. And that's it from our side. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a
bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.